Right now, we're going to move on to the next panel of driving value for patients from real-world evidence and snapshots of what's really going on in these evolving ecosystems. And we're thrilled, to have as part of this Eleanor Perfetto, who, if I can get all her titles correct here, just one moment. There are so many, but I will just take the top ones, where she's the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the National Health Council, and she's a professor at the Maryland School of Pharmacy. So thank you, Eleanor, for being with us today.
Why don't we all come up? So good morning. I'm going to have the whole panel come up, and we'll do a few brief introductions. So with us, we have Derek Angus. Derek is a professor, and he's chair of critical care medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. We have Mark Cziraky. I had to have the tutorial on how to pronounce that. Vice President of Research at HealthCore. We have Kourtney Davis. Kourtney is Global Head of Real-World Evidence at GSK. And Sebastian Schneeweiss, who's a professor of medicine. I didn't need a tutorial on that one because I already knew Sebastian. Professor of medicine and epidemiology at Harvard Medical School. And so we're going to talk about driving value for patients from real-world evidence snapshots of evolving ecosystems. And what we want to talk a little bit about is what's going on right now in real-world evidence and what's happening in data collection, methodology, how it's being used, but really with this underpinning of value for patients. And so that's where I come in. The National Health Council is a large patient advocacy group in Washington, D.C., and our membership includes over 50 of the large patient advocacy groups and many of the small ones also in this country. So our membership is American Diabetes Association, American Heart Association, Alzheimer's Association. So my role sitting in the middle of all of this is to make sure that we keep bringing it back to the voice of the patient and patient engagement. So I want to begin by letting each of our speakers just give us a few minutes about their role and perspective in what we're talking about with real-world evidence today and giving us their snapshot. So we'll begin with Derek.
So first of all, thanks for inviting me, Gigi and everyone else. It's been a great couple of days. So as I said, I do critical care, intensive care. I study sepsis, pneumonia, multisystem organ failure, and have about 20 or 30 years in both health services research and clinical trials. And the intensive care unit has always been one of the most data-rich parts of the critical care, of the healthcare enterprise. And so there's always been an opportunity to try to generate real-world evidence. There's always been large data sets. And I've had a long time thinking about the difficulty with trying to generate causal inference in RWE. And I think the reason I'm here is because we've really been moving towards trying to think about how can we actually continue our love affair with the R in RCT while being frustrated with the rest of the RCT. In other words, how can we think about embedding randomization into real-world evidence generation? And so certainly in our own institution, we've had good success with, for example, doing cluster randomized trials, or step wedge designs, and basically starting off by just being completely intolerant of any quality improvement initiative that just uses a before and after. The lowest bar of evidence is a diff and diff. And that if there's any prospective decision making, you can probably do some sort of randomization. That's probably still not why I was brought here, though. I was probably brought here because we are also in the adaptive platform business, and particularly we're in the adaptive platform trial business around a design called REMAP, randomized embedded multifactorial adaptive platforms, which is trying to think about doing, if you like, a phase 4 version of I-SPY 2, where we're testing in multiple domains at the same time. And we have two big initiatives. One is called REMAP CAP, and that's funded by the European Union FP7 program and in Australia and New Zealand in severe pneumonia, meant to be recruiting patients across hundreds of ICUs, and then testing simultaneously multiple domains, like how to manage the ventilator, what antibiotics to give, what fluids to hang, whether to give steroids, all simultaneously. And then the last thing is we're also trying to do this at UPMC healthcare system because we keep buying hospitals and then we put them all in the same EHR. And so we're now looking at trying to embed a multi-domain intervention around optimizing perioperative care across multiple different hospitals, and trying to have the whole thing run with a light touch inside the EHR. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Derek. My takeaway is that you're working on blending the R in RCT with the R in RWE.
Absolutely. It's RWE for me is, I'm jaded about for the distance you can get with big data. And in Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon is sort of 100 yards from our medical school, we have big data solutions all day long. But we're just constantly dealing with indication bias, and I would only use big data where I cannot randomize.
Mark, can you
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And again, I want to thank Gigi for inviting me. This is my first New Digs event, so it's been quite enjoyable. And thanks again for having me. So I'm Mark Cziraky. I'm Vice President of Research at HealthCore. For those that don't know, HealthCore is the research subsidiary to Anthem. Anthem here in the U.S. is a large health insurer, representing about 40 million Blue Cross Blue Shield lives. So as Trent mentioned earlier, Blue Cross Blue Shield plans cover about 106 or so million folks here in the U.S., and our group represents about 40 million of those individuals. I'm a clinical pharmacist by training, one of the co-founders of HealthCore. We started HealthCore back in the mid-90s, actually with the reason a lot of which this presentation, I guess, and meeting is all around is the frustrations that Newell pointed out, where we've been trying to use RCT evidence for decision-making that they're not built for in the real world. And realizing that early on, as part of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Delaware, which is where we started, great idea, second smallest state in the country. So a challenge from a population standpoint to have enough individuals to start to do, real-world evidence development back at that time frame. For those in the room that were there during that time, very disparate data sources. It was nowhere near fortunate to where we are. I heard a lot of sort of challenges that were presented earlier, but I want to stress we are actually fortunate where we are now and the amount of data assets and data environments that exist. I think there's clearly room to grow and expand that, but we've spent the better part now of 20 years working independently, and now part of then WellPoint, now Anthem, for the past 14 years at really trying to enhance that data environment. We stress that word versus a database. We have a really large administrative claims database that resides in the center of that environment, but realizing quickly that the database itself, administrative claims data built, as mentioned earlier, for different utilities, while it has a lot of strengths, has a lot of weaknesses. And over the years, as we've sort of beaten up those claims data sets as best we can and utilize that as best we can for decision making, we're at a point now where we do have the abilities to do more elegant research designs that include randomization in pragmatic clinical trials, and we're fortunate to have the opportunities to have an environment to do that within. And so a lot of our efforts in the way we've grown our organization is one through extreme focus on the data itself and trying to continue to advance that, to allow our researchers, both internally and through collaborations, to have the best assets that they can work with in their research designs. Two, and another point I want to stress is that despite some of the comments around the lack of collaboration and interaction between groups that may be either disparate in their businesses, if you will, or just at different parts of the healthcare system, we have had extremely collaborative approach since we started. All the groups that Janet mentioned yesterday we're part of or working with. We were formative of part of Sentinel. I've been active in the Sentinel initiative since it started and helped support the federated model that exists today there. Part of NHI Collaborative, BBCIC, IMEDS, Kourtney, et cetera, working closely with Sebastian and his team as well at Harvard and life sciences organizations. So we get to play with a lot of different parts of the system, and our intent, mentioned sort of the data partner relationship. We always want to be more than just that. We want to be part of that scientific partner, and the reason for that is, one, we want to learn, as all are, as we continue to evolve our data environment and the things that can be done with that. But we also want to contribute to the designs to hopefully have them be the most relevant for the end user of the specific initiative. And one of the things we stress about our team and as we work together with other groups is there's, sort of three factors that we have within our group that we can offer out to all of those groups I mentioned as we start to work together on research initiatives, evidence generation. One, we're very sound technically and scientifically from a methodologic standpoint. Two, from a clinical aspect, really understand what's happening in the environment, especially our environment, again, from the assets we have through Anthem, at how practice is happening in current state. And then the third part is understanding the health system that we're putting these designs into, and how can we take the access we have to those data to help us build the most applicable design and the most realistic at this time to actually be able to conduct, right? So I think we have to realize that we all want to get to that pure RWE or pragmatic design, but realizing that we may need to get 3/4 of the way there for this first one as we continue to progress forward. We don't want to let perfection get in the way of very good right now and where we can advance this. So try to bring the practical aspects into our designs. So again, excited to hear about more of the discussion. I'm an optimist, so I think we have a lot of great opportunity in front of us. And the one thing I'll close with as I hand it to the next individual is that in our position, so again, we're a subsidiary group to a large payer, and we bring that payer voice into a lot of the designs we do. We actually bring folks from our payer organization now into these designs as we look to collaborate to get their inputs, to try to build that transparency and trust between all the groups that are involved in the designs at the beginning. So therefore, when the end comes and those outcomes are presented, that it's not one where you can make comment back to where it wasn't designed in a way that you felt was the most appropriate. So really building that trust, building that confidence, building that transparency in our designs.
Great, thank you. So the next speaker is going to be Kourtney.
Thank you. Kourtney Davis, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers, especially Gigi and Mark. So I think I have to start with saying GSK has been a very courageous company in designing pragmatic phase 3B study, which was recently published, the Sulfur Lung Study. And it was a huge learning experience, I think, for the company as well as for the community in using electronic health records to gather the vast majority of the data in the study. It also was the first, we understand, the first joint meeting for advice between MHRA and NICE back in 2010, which really shocked us. But again, going with this optimism theme, we showed it can be done. It actually wasn't necessarily faster than a traditional RCT, but I would say it definitely was meaningful in terms of the actual evidence that read out from that study. And we did have patients involved in the design of the study. We also trained over 3,000 people to conduct that study, because we had to train 80 GP practices, so all the staff that worked in the GP practices, and we had to train community pharmacists. I think it was 130 pharmacies, 80 GP practices, and then as well as support staff who were brought in to supplement the existing staff. So patients were randomized at the point of care, so they went to their regular GP this was for COPD, the first study, and the second study was in asthma. They were not interrupted by having to go to a specific clinical trial site. They went to their regular doctor. So we had to turn all these regular doctors into researchers, which was a gigantic process. And I wouldn't recommend that for every company to go through necessarily to be the pioneer to do a real-world pragmatic trial. But I guess I would just emphasize these things are possible. Another reason it was done in the UK, in case you're wondering, is because there was already an integrated record between the general practice and the hospital. And since this was 3B, we actually had to have a lot of safety reporting, and it had to be, all the data flows had to be validated. And so because there was already an integrated record and a closed system in the National Health Service of the UK, a single identifier for all patients, we were able to pull all of that off. I think it would not have been possible at that time in probably any other place in the world. And Salford is a little suburb of Manchester, if you're not aware of where it's located. And there are two big hospitals that service that area and who are also very enthusiastic about participating. So anyway, we learned a lot about that. If you have other questions about the sulfur lung study and you haven't seen the publication in the New England Journal or lots of other ancillary publications around that study design and all the operations, happy to talk to you at the break. But the other thing I guess I would love to bring up as part of the introduction is that, again, related to COPD, which is a big focus for GSK's respiratory franchise, is that we've worked really closely with the COPD Foundation and a lot of other pharma partners to do things like build the CBQC, the COPD Biomarker Qualification Consortium, which is, again, another sign of industry partners willing to work together to qualify new endpoints and stratification markers. And we did that by pooling all of our RCT data and working with the COPD Foundation, probably someone that Eleanor works with. These things are possible when you have the patients in mind and when you're engaging with the patients. So the COPD Foundation has very engaged patients who really want new endpoints, they want new medicines. And so that's been a great experience for us too.
Thank you. Sebastian.
Well, good morning, everybody. Sebastian Schneeweiss. I do real-world data analytics for the last 20 years, long before we called it real-world data analytics. And let me try to put my thoughts on 3 points in context of platform development, right? So on data, on analysis, on convergence. So, and I always have an upbeat comment and a reality check, right? So with regard to data, it's an incredibly exciting time. There's more and more real-world data generated. There is a convergence of data models that is happening internationally with OMOP, with Sentinel, and other data models, not standards necessarily. The data are still what they are. They're not getting any better by putting standards on top of them. I observe that we have these general purpose data sources and that we have more and more specialty data sources. We see this clearly in cancer, where there's very special data needs. We have data generators and data vendors that focus very much on that niche, and I think we will see more and more of that for other chronic diseases with the desire for more specialized data. The downer here is that the data quality and the data completeness is still not at the point where we want it to be. When you think of rheumatoid arthritis, where we are working with electronic health records, you look at a record from a rheumatologist, you would think you see something like a HAQ score or a DAS score, something like that characterizes functional status. What it says is, patient's okay, come back in 4 months, right? So even with electronic health records, where the big hope is that we get more details, it's not necessarily there. So we have to think about incentivizing the data generators to produce more complete and more detailed data without increasing the burden, obviously. On the analytics, we have made tremendous advances over the last 20 years in getting closer to causal conclusions without randomization, right? And there are situations where you always want to randomize, no question. Even an epidemiologist loves randomization, no question about it, right? But there are great opportunities where randomization is difficult, as you mentioned, where we will deal with non-randomized data. We have made great progress here in better understanding this. However, when I open the journals, right, I see so many studies that make mistakes that are well reported. We understand these mistakes. We know how to avoid these mistakes, and they're there over and over and over again, which provides this difficulty for decision makers, whether it's regulatory or payer, whether they can trust any of these studies, which is very frustrating because there are really good studies out there, and there are a bunch of bad studies, and it's hard to differentiate between the two of them, right? So we need more transparency that makes it easier and more efficient for reviewers to understand the quality of studies in order then to make a decision based on high quality studies. With regard to third point, convergence, bringing the randomized trial world closer together with the real world data. We saw this, and Mark mentioned this already, pragmatic randomized trials, the COPD studies. That will happen more and more, of course. But what I also see is that when patients are randomized in phase 3 or phase 4 trials, we should always ask for informed consent to link EHR data, claims data, not only for longer-term follow-up. We have seen this published many times already, the West of Scotland trial from statins and things like that, great examples for that, which is enhancing the RCT per se. But even more importantly, to calibrate the real-world data to the RCT world. If we have one patient, and that one patient is in the RCT, and that one patient, you have the claims data for that patient. You look at the characteristics. They look very different. You wouldn't believe that's the same patient just based on how we record claims data. I'm not saying they're necessarily all bad claims data, just different because we see the shadows of what is really going on, right? And we interpret backwards what happened that created the shadows, right? Like in Socrates' caves. Having the ability to calibrate those two data sources brings much more value to the real world data, where we then can generalize to the actual target population, right? Which will satisfy the regulatory needs of a phase 3 trial, whatever this will be, or phase 2b, as well as the payer need or HTA need, understanding the real world implication of these treatments in my target population.
Thank you. So Sebastian, I'm going to take my first question based off of something that you raised early in your remarks. You were talking about data quality and trying to incentivize for generating high quality data. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And I'd like for the other speakers to jump in on the same topic.
Yeah, so, and I'm not a specialist in incentivizing. I think I've heard there are specialists in developing schemes, and I think we do need that here very seriously. There's one way is to throw more money at the problem. That's one problem, one solution, obviously, but that's very limited. You will never have enough money to generate the perfect data, right? So we need some sort of incentives where the data generators, healthcare professionals, other groups, patient groups, are incentivized to produce better, more consistent, more complete data, right? And what is the incentivization? What we do see in these specialty data generator agencies, you see these feedback loops, right? And I don't want to mention any specific agencies, but where the data generator in short sequence receives quality reports on how do you practice compared to your peers and things like that. And that incentivizes the data generator to produce better and more complete data, right? Because you will be measured according to that, right? So more intelligent incentive structures are needed here as well.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, from the position we're in, again, if you think about a large commercial health plan, you have your provider network and member network that's underneath that. So from the provider network, we are in a unique position that to have some influence on the quality of data that's captured through different quality metrics, different programs like clinical pathways in oncology is a great example of where that's given us some new data assets that we wouldn't have had without that program because of the requirements to contribute clinical data into a process for med pharm policy and approvals of therapies for the individual. So an example of where data can be enhanced and quality can be enhanced, and we've done validation that's published on those data to show the accuracy in which they're captured for the need, again, more for patient care and a reimbursement model. So I think there's ways in the payer marketplace to have some influence to increase that quality. The other thing I'll mention, and we've seen this in our pragmatic studies to date, is the interest at the practitioner level and willingness for them to add additional data elements into what goes through their normal practice flow. And these are not, and I want to stress, these are not 50-page ECRF type documents that they're doing, but they are additional data elements that may be not standard captured during that time frame, but they see the value in what the extra time they're contributing, coming back to them and their patient directly in what they're doing. And also, you know, there's potential that can tie back to a quality measure. If you're involved in a diabetes study in a pragmatic design and you're seeing benefits to your patients getting to target levels and there's an incentive paid on that, there's obviously some connection, right, to increase the quality. But we've seen change happen at the practice level for enhancing the way they capture data or consistency in the way they capture data, but there's always got to be that value tied to it, and value does not need to always be dollars. It is value they can see also to their practice, to how they can benefit their patients, or of course, if it is a business piece, you know, obviously benefit the business side of the practice.
Well, I would just add, I think that thinking about how the patient can also be engaged in improving quality of their physician or healthcare practitioners recording. I mean, we could get a little bit outside the box with that maybe, because we do know that patients care a lot about the accuracy of the information, and that it could become part of a record that would lead to their care being improved. So I think I would just encourage all the creative minds here to think about how we could also engage the patients who.
I would strongly support that. I think one of the things that we did in the last years, in the last summer, had a roundtable on real-world evidence for our membership. And the questions that we asked the patient community were things like, what would you need to have or what would you need to know in order to be able to trust this information? And they gave us a long list of the things, and you won't be surprised by the things that are on that list. It's the kinds of things that any of us would have come up with. So, being able to have that trust for them to be able to use the information is also quite important, and the patient advocacy groups are quite active in that because very often they serve as the arbiters of evidence that comes out for their patient community. Their patient community is asking them, should I use this? Is this any good? Will we have side effects? Who is the best patient population for that? They get asked those questions, and they are making those decisions. So let's move on to the next topic, off of quality and on to when we start thinking about not just the post-approval time period, but I want to call it more like the non-trial time period, because I think it can be preclinical, it can be post-approval. But how do we think about embedding the idea of trial design like randomization in a structure that collects real-world evidence and having us be a little bit more streamlined, having the platform consider those kinds of things? Are these the kinds of things that are going on right now? I think you were talking about pragmatic trials being incorporated into your processes. Can we see more of evidence of how that's working, and what might these data collection tools need to look like in order for it to be a more streamlined process?
So I'll start, and then I think Derek probably can chime in from the experience you're having. But so from our standpoint, we're faced with a broader challenge to that, I would argue, than integrated delivery networks and others that may be more closed and controlled in the technology they're using and the way they're using it across their provider network and members. So we, if you think of a large commercial health plan, there's a number of different EMR systems that reside underneath our network. We are not connected to all those EMR systems. I want to stress that. So we're able to go out and we are able to access medical records on our members throughout that, but we're tapping into those systems to pull the information out. It's not something that's progressively integrated, which I think is what you're referring to. So I'd go back to if, one, there's lack of standardization across all the EMR. So I'll just, even within the EMR single source, it still varies. The interoperability is extremely challenging across that when you're trying to work within our world. Even within practice, there's so much variation that happens in the way practitioners use EMRs within their systems that until there's a way to standardize that better and whatever incentive can be created for that, our challenge will always be there in our type of an environment. I think if you move more to integrated delivery networks and others that can be more embedded into practice, the recommendation, I would say, from our experiences there to do is to make it as least, change practice as least as possible, if you will, from what the patient flow needs to be. That's a challenge, I think, for all of us in this room and probably all researchers to really critically look at what is really needed for the specific initiative and keep it limited to that. And that's hard to do. And we work a lot with our clients on that issue of really, okay, we really don't need this. We'll go down to the smaller caption and make it more realistic, and then embed it in some fashion, into that practice standard and have some training around that. So again, I think we're faced with a bigger challenge than maybe Derek and your, UPMC and others out there, and other closed systems.
Derek?
Yeah. So maybe I won't talk about closed systems because we're not all in one yet.
True.
At least,
Yeah.
But more broadly in the field of intensive care, there's been a long culture in a number of countries and the philosophy of creating registries where everyone that comes into the ICU, some data are written down. So in the UK, both Scotland and then also England and Wales NHS has been collecting data on every single patient that hits the ICU in a standardized way. Australia does the same thing. And now no trial is written without, first of all, plumbing all of that registry data to really understand the distribution of the patient population, the event rates, and so forth. And then they increasingly look at trying to collect as much of the data as possible from inside the registry and ask only for the money for the incremental cost of the trial on the back of the registry. That's what I would call embedding. I think of embedding as two arms. One arm is embedding in the data, and then the other arm is embedding in the culture of the care. And so, for example, my colleagues in Australia spend a lot of time trying to isolate very specific clinical questions. For example, someone drops their blood pressure, what's the bag of fluid you reach for to hang first. It seems like the most trivial thing, but we still don't know whether we should give salty water or albumin. And they did a trial in many thousands of patients where they found out actually how to blind every bag of fluid, and they called it SAFE, which I can't remember the acronym, but it was basically salt versus albumin. And it got so ingrained in the culture that my friend who was the PI talks about the day they had their fellow, and the patient's blood pressure drops, and the fellow says, "Get me a bag of SAFE fluid." And the nurse goes, "What do you mean? The trial is over." And they're going, "Well, then what do I do?" That's ultimate embedding.
That is true.
And I think, so I think you really need to fix both arms. So embedding is, you must, I mean, you said it too, but you have to think about the culture of the care process and the data, and those are two separate things that have to be tackled in parallel.
And one more comment I just thought, as Derek's mentioning too, because we've run into this a lot, and I think it was mentioned yesterday in the presentations, was, as individuals are enrolled into practices and the use rights for the data that exist in these, as we're now trying to connect those, and there's a technical aspect, excuse me, of that, and then there's also the use aspect of the abilities to bring those together for the uses we want to do, and that is still a big roadblock out there. There's many times where you don't have those abilities to bring it together for the purposes we want to use it for, which again is positive purposes, but still that need and the allowance by our legal and others to be able to leverage that. And there are techniques, I know Hashing and others, that can bring it together, but remember, a lot of what we're trying to do is not just roll it up, but unroll it afterwards, because we want to enroll in outreach and do other things to intervene in a positive way to intervene to make some change. So it's that use right of the data as well.
Right, and that was another thing that was expressed by patients at the real-world evidence meeting that we had this past summers. They're willing to provide their data for science. They're willing to do it. They just want to know. They just want to be,
That's right.
they just want that transparency. They want to be able to say, yes, I agree. I know who's got it, what they're doing with it, and it's that transparency part. They're not against it. They just want to be included in the conversation.
It's usually not the patient that has the problem, it's the institution.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's jump now to the next level of this, because now we have information and evidence, and we need to figure out how to get it out there and get it used. And so my next question really has to do with what are the kinds of things that need to change so that we can see, or what experiences have you had in changing the systems so that we can see where once the evidence is found, it actually gets translated and used in some way in meaningful decision making, and how can we have systems that allow support of that and can incorporate that so that when someone was blindly grabbing for the safe bag, the information actually got it to those individuals on which one they should be using at that time.
Yeah, after the trial was published, did they actually know the answer?
Do they know an answer? And if they know an answer, how can the system help them do the right thing? So any comments on what's happening there and how we can help with that translation and support that decision making, especially in decision support systems?
Well, it's not fair. You're all looking at me now.
I'm just looking to the right.
Once you have decided what the evidence is, and that, of course, it's its own process, right? Pharma is actually doing a very good job in translating that to prescribers, right? We can argue whether that's the right evidence or not, but they have figured that out to influence prescribing decisions, right? One way or another, right? Jerry Awan, my boss, has piloted this or developed this academic detailing where unbiased evidence is using the same techniques as pharma companies use to engage physicians, prescribers in learning about the newest evidence and translating that. It's very resource intensive, but quite powerful as well, and can be used for the right purpose and can be abused as well, right, the system.
I guess my question is in the idea of, if we're using these systems to collect the data and we want to improve that data quality, and you mentioned earlier feedback to the providers, to the clinicians, can the systems actually serve that support purpose also? And in terms of the data that you're getting, if you have evidence in your system that something's going wrong somewhere, can you turn that around by using the data that you have which is largely coming from real-world evidence, from the prescribing practices you might see or the other things that might come through?
So functionally, yes. So when we think about ecosystems in our integrated research network and other things that we're able to do, again, underneath specifically our umbrella, the abilities to go in bi-directional are there and built that way intentionally because of the need, whether current or future state, to be able to have that capability. I think, to your original question around the more use out of the evidence that's generated, there's multiple levels to that. There's use at the payer decision, population-based management level, and then there's the decision support at the practice level with the patient in mind, of course, there with the practitioner. Two different targets, right? Two different, I'd argue, designs probably, and even the evidence that's generated there. But the capability of an ecosystem network to be able to do that is critical. Because one is related to broader decision making, two maybe again influencing patient care, or if there's other issues that need to be addressed in care management, other things that health plans and other groups are a part of. So I think, and the last piece too to remember that, and again the RCT. RCTs obviously have extreme value in what we are doing and approval process here in the U.S. And so the comments I'm making related to these additional data elements are additive to those data. And we're not moving that away from decision makers at least in the payer world. It's just that finally we're at the realization that we are able to build different designs to meet the questions they're having rather than try to retrofit this design that wasn't intended for that use.
Great.
I would just like to add one more thing, picking up on something Sebastian said in the beginning, which is I think if the methods continue to get stronger around real-world evidence, study designs and analyses and interpretation, that they could become also more influential in changing care. But I think that there is, as long as there's more uncertainty around that, they will have less influence than traditional trial designs. I think these hybrids are promising because we're able to use both elements to some extent, but keep the randomization but in the instances where we can't, I think we have to keep moving forward the field with respect to methods and also training reviewers for journals on methods so that we don't get junk published.
Yeah, I think though that even if you said that a traditional phase 3 RCT had robust internal validity, a lot of the things we're wanting to promote into practice, there is some partially justified, sometimes well justified, sometimes less justified skepticism about the results. Even if it had strong internal validity, people think, well, it doesn't really, everyone says it doesn't apply to my patient, but sometimes it really doesn't. And some of the lag in evidence diffusion is because we have trouble sort of moving the needle on people's skepticism. And this is one of the reasons why we would like to have an embedded learning platform trial is in part because we think it's often quite artificial, at least in our field, that you get to the point that you have the big declarative RCT in the New England, okay, our work here is done. It frames knowledge translation as if the problem is with the T and not with the K in the T. I actually think that part of the reason that it doesn't translate well is because the knowledge still isn't robust enough. And so you need to sort of have a world of people thinking about this continuous learning, but we divide the world into researchers who embrace uncertainty and then quality improvement specialists who say, give me the thing once you definitely know the answer. and we never definitely know the answer. So.
Well, and also, Kourtney, to your point, I did some work with some editors this past year, talking with them about how they view real-world evidence and do they treat it differently than clinical trial data. They all said, for the most part, that when a manuscript comes in and they look at it, their initial view of it is very similar to what they would do for any other design. Is the question good? Does the data align with the question? Were the methods as rigorous as possible? And so they at least do think about it that systematically. But then they all said, oh, but if an RCT comes in, we automatically put that in for review. But if a real-world evidence study comes in, we really think about whether or not it even goes to reviewers. So there is that barrier still. I'm going to ask you a question now about patient engagement. Over the last few years, we've seen a real change in the way that drug development is happening with the involvement of patients in patient-focused drug development, something that the FDA is embracing. And it really means that patients are more involved in helping to design the protocols and helping to contribute to, whether or not they would participate in the study in the first place, what kind of changes would need to be made in order for them to enroll, for them to stay in the study, but also in the selection of outcome endpoints and ensuring that the outcome endpoints are endpoints that patients actually care about. And so what I want to ask is, how do we ensure that in this process that we're talking about, especially when it comes to generating and adapting systems to gather real-world evidence, that patients are engaged in that process also? They're engaged in this consideration of what outcomes are important and how the data are collected. How do we use the data that many of the patient groups have, because they have registries and surveys that they've been collecting for many years, and how do we embed that in what we think of as real-world evidence? And then also, how do we not think about patients as a deterrent when we're going through this process, that they're just in the way, or we have to figure out how to get around them? So, Kourtney, I want to start with you, because you mentioned that you had patients who were engaged in the development of the trial that was conducted. So could you talk a little bit about perspectives on patient engagement in this process?
Sure. Well, they gave feedback on the early draft of the protocol, and I think we're critical in understanding whether it would be feasible or not. And I don't think it was at all cumbersome. I think it was really enlightening. And they actually helped to make sure that the recruitment was successful ultimately. So I think it actually, there's no way that it slows down your study. In some ways, it can actually help accelerate your study. Because you'll see whether it's resonating or not, and you can quickly adjust if you need to. So I think it was a very positive experience. And the patients were huge advocates for the study.
Typically, patient input's now included in all of our feasibilities as we go out to do our site-based observation of work. I think it's, again, the challenge is dependent on which specific disease area you're working in. I think there's probably more influence that may have on the ultimate design, especially around enrollment and abilities, but we're building in everything we can now.
Could you talk a little bit about how that happens?
Yeah, so again, we're, during our, if you think about our access, we have the environment at which these studies are going to be participating in, those members that ultimately will be enrolling into the studies. So we'll set up focus groups, other types of ways in which we'll outreach to, to folks within our population, and then also partner with patient specialty groups that, again, any way we can get that input to help influence the way at which we're designing, both on operational success, but also on the outcomes of interest. And, the other side, I would say, is to our parent organization, is there's a lot more interest in, not that there wasn't before, but I'd say they're stressing more about the interest in the patient behavior, patient impact that's going to have. And so we welcome that. Let's move that needle as fast as we can. Yeah.
So I can clearly echo that. So I'm an investigator in PCORnet, who's PCORI funded, and PCORI has this nice framework of patient engagement. It's tremendous value in having them engaged early on. I'm a physician, but every time I'm in a meeting with a patient, I'm learning something that I was not fully aware or wouldn't prioritize. As I have done then after the meeting. The data generated by patient groups is enormous richness, right? But a key challenge of any of these data is linking them to the data from the professional healthcare system, right? We need to do this in order, again, to calibrate the information to see whether this is selected information by participants that are more willing to, the patients are more willing to participate, or is it generalizable, endpoints that are measured in the professional healthcare system. So this, again, is largely a data privacy concern and less of a technical concern.
Mm-hmm. Eleanor, can I make one more comment, too, to add to that is something, again, and I'm speaking more to in the pragmatic trial world and in that area, is engaging the practitioner. It's going to be the investigator and site. These are not clinical trial centers. These are practicing providers that have the abilities, what we use the term naive, and they're not naive in a sense of not being able to conduct research or have conducted research in their past. However, to really get their input into these designs, because many times if you don't do that, and that's along with the patient's input, but it really needs to be a combination of that, because we're going out to a different group of individuals to conduct those types of studies, and we need to make sure we get their input in that design.
Yeah, I want to give an opportunity to open it up for questions for the audience. So if anyone has a question, please come to the microphones and While you're being inspired to do that, I'll tell you that I know of a case study where a company actually had a protocol. They invited patients in that recruited for the purposes of not actually being recruited for the study or for the purposes of going through the protocol, but for the purposes of actually walking through the protocol in the clinic where it's going to happen. And they did it in 3 or 4 sites where the study would be happening. That exercise of the patients spending the time doing that with the clinicians changed the protocol considerably before it was started, and it was a very worthwhile thing to do. So, Newell?
Hi, Newell McAwee from Oringer. So my question is specifically about data that patients would submit. And some of you may know the story of what happened in Canada with CADIT, but they invited patients to be on their review committees, and they also set up guidelines for data. So there was a whole process for how patients would engage with CADIT. And ultimately, especially for small patient advocacy groups, they couldn't meet the quality standard imposed by CADIT. And so therefore, CADIT wouldn't use the data that they collected. And it cost money to meet the quality standards, and the only way they could do that was to get funding from pharmaceutical companies. But that also disqualified their data. So I just wonder if there's any thoughts about how you sort of overcome these challenges that especially the small patient advocacy groups have.
Have any of you had experience with that? I mean, I can tell you that from our perspective, we provide support to our organizations to help them learn about things like the quality standards. We help to link them up with researchers and scientists who can help them. But to your point, these very often are small organizations that have difficulty raising funds to even keep the lights on, never mind sustain a research infrastructure. And so, we have to do more about making sure that organizations understand that that kind of pharmaceutical support with appropriate transparency and disclosures can actually be something that's very worthwhile. We also encourage collaborations, and so we encourage the patient organizations to form collaborations with multiple companies, multiple patient organizations, bring in universities, so that those collaborations can actually be self-sustaining and can be viewed as perhaps less influenced by any particular one company or organization.
Can I just more generally about the problem of low quality data in real world evidence, not just the fact that it doesn't reach a certain standard when it's patient reported, but regardless of the source. I think one of the problems is that in the clinical trial world, there's definitely, it's run in a way more with an accounting philosophy than an economist philosophy. Right. In other words, if you didn't observe it and know it to be true, it's absolutely unusable. And there's really been a lot of explosion of far more robust methods to understand how tolerably messy the data can be. And I would say that we're still a little slow on the regulatory side to catch up with those methods. And so people, for example, will often say, well, you can't use the EHR because you can't trust it. And it's not whether you can or can't trust it, it's is it tolerably messy as opposed to intolerably messy, or is it intolerably inaccurately reported? And if we don't move the mindset on this is going to be a hard slog. Trying to make every piece of data as carefully observed as takes place in a pharma-funded phase 3 is going to bring us to our knees.
Yeah.
So we say fit for purpose, right?
Fit for purpose.
We don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, hi, Ramsey Dagger from Pfizer again. I actually had a follow-up for you, Dr. Davis, because you really talked about the opportunities and challenges you had in the upfront and having to train 3,000 folks, whether they're directly involved in the care or support. You talked about getting the patient input very early in the design. So my question is more about part 2 and 3. Part 1 is all those things you talked about. Part 2 would be, how things went during the conduct of the trial. Part 3 would be in analyzing the data. Any comments on the challenges side or the positives and opportunities that you saw because of the way you approached the front end? Did that translate into your assumptions being met or having to be adjusted in part 2 or part 3? Any comments there?
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. Well, I guess one operational challenge that happened is we ran out of patients. I didn't tell you that part, but despite all the beautiful planning around feasibility, we had projected a slightly higher rate of consent for the study, and so. Sorry, let me get my mic back on here. So we actually had to go to some contiguous neighborhoods and get more patients, which actually was part of the length of the study, was to get more patients enrolled. But I do think that one happy part of the part 2-3 was actually the safety data collection was extremely successful. So that automatic feed that came from the hospital and having a safety team that was able to review it within 24 hours and immediately follow up with anything that looked to be of concern. I think the feedback from the regulators was super positive, that actually it was extremely consistent, much higher quality than we usually see in a global study, and it actually was able to fulfill a pass requirement. So that was actually a great outcome from the good planning in the beginning. I think the use of EHR was a challenge in part for statistics, because we had phase 3 statisticians working with EHR data. That is usually not the case in a pharma company. So there was a lot of exchange between my team and real world evidence. We work with it every day, trying to explain some things to statisticians, but also we had done pre-work to validate exacerbations as an endpoint. And that I think also was helpful in terms of having code lists ready that had gone through rigorous review. I'm trying to think of anything else on the interpretation side. I think we also, I will mention another plug, we did a complementary study, which was a cohort study using a matched cohort from CPRD. We actually looked at whether there might have been a Hawthorne effect operating on the study. It was another concern when you have an open label study, which is quite unusual in phase 3. We were able to, we just presented that this summer and putting a manuscript in, but we were able to show actually that the recording by the physicians did improve. We looked at the usual care arm and compared it to the regular practice in the UK, and that was a really interesting learning too. There's a little bit less moving of patients around on treatments as well. So, but overall, patients looked extremely generalizable who got enrolled in Salford and who actually has COPD in the UK, so that was another learning. Thanks.
So before we go to the last question, I'm going to give the panelists warning because they have one last question that I asked them, and the question is what's their Christmas wish for what will advance real-world evidence to improve value for patients in the coming year? And then we'll go to this question, and then they will do a round robin of answering that question. So final question?
This is going to be a little bit more out of the box type of a question. Because I really appreciate all of the work that's being done by all of the different groups to kind of come to this place of convergence with databases and what is the value added of the data. I do want to mention that a long time ago I worked on medical claims data sets, and I came across some data that ended up being fraudulent. I became very interested in that whole area. And there's at least 2 books that influenced me. One was License to Steal by Malcolm Sparrow, How Fraud Bleeds America Health Case System. And another one just published last year, Healthcare Fraud Investigation Guidebook by Charles Piper. And I'm just curious, has anyone come across that as part of your work when you're trying to design?
Would you like to take that one on?
Sure. I mean, fraud and abuse happens in the U.S. here in the systems, and we have groups at our parent organization that's obviously very focused on that. And I think you bring a great point up, and I mentioned this early on in our hour here, is the challenges with relying purely on administrative claims data. And so we design a lot of our studies, we go to that best data source when it comes to the outcomes of interest we're looking for, and typically in our, again, I know we're focusing on, at least I am, on the pragmatic designs. Many times that's going down to something that can be validated rather than just relying on a pure claim source. I think as we evolve those systems, there's going to be some checks and balances to hopefully strengthen that. Fraud's challenging in the systems, as is known, and I think it's something to be cognizant about, but at the same time, that I think there's ways, at least in the populations we're looking at. Remember, these are subgroups of a very large membership that we can hopefully tighten that down a bit to be confident in that data quality.
Thank you. So Kourtney, I'm going to ask you to start. Your Christmas wish.
I think, well, can I have two?
All right.
I was going to say that. I get two then too. So.
We're in a generous mood today.
The first is just, continued engagement on this topic across the whole spectrum of stakeholders, because I think that's the only way to get real-world evidence to be robust and part of, ideally labeling eventually someday beyond safety section. And then the second part is just to continue to work really closely with our patient advocacy partners as, a really important stakeholder in that mix. Thanks.
So I'll take two as well. And I was going to ask for two before you did, but I'll jump on that now. The first one I would say is that 21st Century Cures and PDUFA 6 give us what we're hoping comes from that, in a sense of clarity and direction, and hopefully abilities to take real-world evidence and apply it into labeling and in the pre-approval world. So that's my big wish, I would say. And so the second one is that, and with all due respect, because we use Salford as an example all the time of what's been done and how we can enhance it and obviously grow from it. Exactly. But I want a Salford in the U.S. So I'd love to have an example that we can point to that's done in our system here in the U.S., taking the learnings and, again, continue to advance that in different systems that probably are more challenging and maybe a little easier, but more challenging, more so to implement those kind of studies.
Sebastian?
So my big Christmas wish is that we go away from global statements like RCTs are good, real-world data is bad, but have more differentiated discussions and realizing, well, there are good and bad trials and good and bad real-world data analyses, and that we as evidence generators do a better job in being transparent of what we have that allows other people to better evaluate our work.
I think that's been your Christmas wish for a long time now.
So I'm just interested in a true functioning API for the EHR. So that Cerner or Epic just really becomes like an analog to digital converter. And then it's easy to get the signal out the backside, and then have third-party developers, whether they're laying down an app for a highly sophisticated platform trial or a decision support tool. If I could have that for this Christmas, as opposed to
whenever Christmas.
That would be awesome. So.
Okay, and I will ask you all to please thank this panel for a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Such a good job.
Excellent. Let's thank Eleanor for being an incredible moderator and getting it done right to the minute on time. Thank you very much.